Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the FCC. You still have a few minutes to finish your meal while I'm doing the announcement. My name is Florence de Changy. I'm a reporter with Le Monde and the French National Radio and the president of the club. Delighted to be your host today. It was Victor, actually, supposedly, but he's working from abroad, as you may know. Please turn off your phones. Feel free to tweet about this event and use the handle of the FCC Hong Kong. I'll briefly let you know about 3 coming up events. Thursday, 1st of November, and actually on the following weeks we will host some writers, authors coming with the Literary Festival. Next Thursday we'll host Jeff Dyer, not a reporter, on this format. And on the evening of the same day, Thursday, 1st of November, we will host Barbara Pollock, who is very well-known journalist writing about Chinese contemporary art, and this will be a conversation actually with her, different format in the veranda. And then the following week, another author, famous author, Jonathan Miller, who will talk about Duterte, Fire and Fury in the Philippines. Yes, and much more coming up. Now, about today, a little red book of a different kind. Rule Bauhinia, writing a new Hong Kong story. We are delighted to host Christine Loh Kung-Wai, who, as you know, she spoke here a few times before. She served in the public. She started Civic Exchange after being a lawmaker. She was the Undersecretary for the Environment. And she co-wrote this book with Professor Richard Cullen, who is a visiting professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong, and is from Australia. They worked together for about 20 years, I understand, and on many different issues. And then they came up with this idea of the little book called No Third Person. They will explain what they mean. The book is for sale, I think $75 outside. Feel free to get in on your way and get it signed. The format is that Christine will speak a little bit, Richard will take over, Christine will wrap up, and then we'll open the floor. Please welcome the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. It is a book sale, so we hope that we will persuade you that you might, before you leave, buy a book. Richard and I are very old friends, and we have actually co-written more academic type of papers before. And being good friends, we constantly talk about the place we love, which is Hong Kong. And we detect in ourselves and in the community that there is, or has been now for a while, a high level of anxiety in Hong Kong. And we've tried to understand that. And because we exchange views with each other constantly, we also find that in many areas our thinking is quite similar. And then we had the opportunity with abbreviated books to be invited to perhaps write down our thoughts, which is what we did. And we did this over the summer. We asked ourselves that at this time, what it is that we might do. And I'll state it up front. In this very difficult time when many things are shifting, not just actually in Hong Kong, things are shifting around the world. And for perhaps people of our era, the way that we've looked at the world, the way that we've taken the world for granted in a way as we grew up, this is probably a good time for all of us to take a pause and just rethink a little bit about what's happening. So we have 6 chapters in this book. In the introduction, We've talked about using the narrative of a story to think about Hong Kong. What is the story for Hong Kong today? Where are we? Where have we come from? And with that, maybe we can say to ourselves, what is the story for Hong Kong going forward? We've looked at Hong Kong as this amazing protagonist. This protagonist is on an amazing journey, and the journey is not over, which is why we've used the narrative of a story, rewriting the Hong Kong story, taking the story forward. In chapter 1, we address the issue of anxiety. We know that the past, what we call British Hong Kong, it came to a formal end in 1997, but there are obviously lingering aspects of that, because that was our lives, that's our memory of Hong Kong. And this is the way we've put it. The new narrative requires various stakeholders to plumb deep to discover Hong Kong's true essence and to highlight its diversity as a contribution to China and the world rather than something that sets it apart from China. So we're proposing, is it possible to look at the Chinese story or the Hong Kong story as a part of the Chinese story rather than necessarily setting Hong Kong apart? The new narrative cannot just focus on politics, as there is more to Hong Kong than that. The Hong Kong Phoenix will be reborn only by the Hong Kong people reaching deep within ourselves. And this comes back to the title of No Third Person. The story of Hong Kong, our trials and tribulations going forward, that's going to have to be settled here in Hong Kong. Of course, Hong Kong being a part of China, being part of the Chinese story, it is us in Hong Kong that we have to deal with Beijing and the mainland. So when we say no third person, what we are trying to say is, in weaving a new story for Hong Kong and China, Hong Kong and the mainland, we are the two main protagonists that have to deal with that. Chapter 2, we call it China as it is. So if there was a time that we can call British Hong Kong, are we moving into a time of Chinese Hong Kong? And what does that really mean? We go through a story, I think it's important, of how China had experienced the world in the last couple of hundred years. Because I think Hong Kong people know quite well in their hearts the struggle that China has had to be on, an extraordinary, compelling story. And China is having to claw its way into modernization. So again, we'd like to read a very small paragraph to you here about Hong Kong and its colonial experience. Colonialism imparted some benefits along with its ills. These benefits were not, however, evenly distributed. While China paid much of the price, Hong Kong reaped much of the benefit in the form of such institutions as its courts and universities, a professional civil service, the English language, prosperity, and close relations with the English-speaking world. Hong Kong is therefore uniquely well-positioned and perhaps uniquely obliged to help the erstwhile colonized and colonizer reconcile their views of the past and work towards a future of more equal benefit. This could be a part of a new narrative to improve deliberation about China, as well as East-West relations. Hong Kong should be an expert on the mainland's development experience and its political system, and thus be the primary international translator of how it works. Some foreign universities and think tanks specialize in such studies, but Hong Kong has actual experience under colonialism, and with its Chinese sensibilities could be a preeminent East-West decoder. So in a way, this is part of a recommendation. Because we have experienced colonialism, because we're part of China's modern history, because we are part of China, and China is developing, do we see Hong Kong as a good place to be the expert, to be the decoder of this relationship? I think Hong Kong is uniquely placed to do this, but we haven't really given ourselves this role. There are, of course, many people in Hong Kong who are China specialists, who under many aspects of Hong Kong. But as a whole, Hong Kong has not aspired to play that role. And I think that could be an interesting role for Hong Kong. The next chapter is Hong Kong as it is. And this is a chapter about Hong Kong identity. We clearly have a special identity. And our identity has come from our British past, the fact that we are more international than cities in China. We have the Cantonese language. We talk a lot about that, our way of life. And of course, our own identity is important in how we set social, political viewpoints. So we just want to say here is what has also set us apart in the past and in the future is Hong Kong's ability and hopefully continuing desire to pursue excellence. Excellence in every field. As China becomes more developed, what is the stage that China is in today, and what is it that it could use Hong Kong for? What is it that that Hong Kong can offer? We have seen in the past that Hong Kong was a trendsetter for everything from food to fashion to movies and so on. But actually Hong Kong has also been a trendsetter in business models, in many, many other things, in management, hospitals and railways and so on. Many, many of these things that Hong Kong do well, we have done it because over the years we have pursued excellence. What we try to say in our book is this is still the way forward and we must not give up on that. Now the next chapter deals with the basics of the law, and I'm going to pass over to Richard Cullen to say a few words.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to the FCC for this invitation. During the long period of British rule, around about 150 years, Hong Kong typically did a remarkable job of playing very well with the cards it was dealt with. In a number of important ways, it's continued to do this since 1997. And I want to look briefly at some key examples which show this, I believe, related to the operation of the law in the HKSAR. I want to say something firstly and broadly about the rule of law in Hong Kong, and then offer some brief observations on the operation of the basic law in Hong Kong. When I first came to Hong Kong over 25 years ago, it was to teach law at the new law school, at that time at City University. And I've been teaching law students here now for around 20 years. Good law schools are one of the fundamental pillars of a strong rule of law system. And at the core of any good law school is the quality of its students. And I can say with some emphasis and based on my own experience that the student quality in Hong Kong is very strong indeed. Students vary, of course, but the best students in Hong Kong and the ones who are likely to go on to be leaders in the profession and or possibly join the judiciary are simply outstanding, and they're as good and regularly better, I must say, than some students or the students I've taught elsewhere. So this law school foundation is one of the things that provides a key support for the rule of law in Hong Kong. And let me just summarise quickly what I think are probably the other key elements. Firstly, the high integrity and high quality of our judges. Overall, I think we're very fortunate. As well as that comes an independent judiciary, a judiciary that really does make decisions based on its understanding of the law and its highly informed understanding of the law. The fact that the judiciary these days is criticised from every possible spectrum, part of the spectrum, I think, tends to confirm their independence. They upset people of all sorts. Also very important is an independent profession, and we've got that here in Hong Kong. It's strongly staffed, both the bar and the practising solicitor profession. More importantly, these professions still regulate themselves. They're under the control of their own senior members and controlled by proper mechanisms of the sort that have historically been used to control legal professions. That is, they're not regulated directly by the government. And finally, on this point, let me just say, mention something which is often overlooked, which perhaps we take for granted, but I think is a key indicator of the quality of the rule of law in Hong Kong. And that is the fact that Hong Kong remains one of the safest big cities in the world. So I think this is particularly important for working people in Hong Kong, the grassroots, those who live in the least well-off sectors of society. They can do so here in a way which frankly is just not possible where I come from in Melbourne. It's a good place, Melbourne. It wins all of these livable city awards, but you don't travel on certain trains late at night. Not a problem in Hong Kong. I feel completely comfortable going anywhere at any time. So now let me just pass on to say a few words about the basic law. Bottom line for me is that it really has worked remarkably well. It's a constitution, in my view, a well-drafted one. 21 years on, there have been problems. That's normal with any constitution that you're going to have ironing out to do, and will continue to have to do that for the next several decades. That's the way that constitutions work. I want to focus, because we don't have much time, on Article 158, which is generally agreed to be the most controversial section in the Basic Law, because it confers a power on the Standing Committee of the NPC to interpret the Basic Law. Now, with any law of this sort, a constitutional arrangement between a central government and a regional government, which has so much autonomy as Hong Kong has, you're going to have a constitutional umpire. The Basic Law gives us the answer to that. It is ultimately the Standing Committee of the NPC. The CFA has a role, but the final stop, where the buck stops as it were, is the Standing Committee. We know from a decision indeed of the CFA that the Standing Committee has a freestanding and plenary power to interpret the Basic Law. We know too that the CFA, the Court of Final Appeal, can initiate interpretations of the Basic Law itself, ask the Standing Committee to interpret. And we also know from the first interpretation that the government of Hong Kong can request interpretations. Just a quick word on that first interpretation. I was here when it happened, and I was one of those who wondered, was the sky going to fall? And I looked for some time afterwards. But briefly, no, it didn't, and no, it hasn't. It was a controversial decision in its way, as all of the interpretations have been. But when you look back on the interpretations, I think you can see a pattern which emerges. Firstly, they're reactive. That is, the Standing Committee perceives, or the government in Beijing perceives what they see as a central or a significant problem in Hong Kong, which may need interpretation. So it reacts to problems which are perceived, like the right of abode decision by the CFA, for example. Next, the decisions are very based on solving the problem as it's identified. So they're actually quite narrowly crafted. The arguments given for the decisions are quite sparse, and certainly from a common law point of view, inadequate. But they're very narrowly crafted to solve the particular problem. And we've had 5 in 21 years. As I say, they've all been controversial. I think the one in 2004, dealing with how the political reform process starts, is the most radical, clearly. But the pattern that emerges is a fairly conservative approach. It's a steady pattern, and it's the responses, the decisions are quite narrowly crafted. They don't spread out. They certainly don't spread out in the way a typical constitutional empowered court in a common law jurisdiction would work. They're much more narrow than that. So what about the future? Well, the past is no guide to successive investments. I know we're always told that by stockbrokers, but it's the best guide we've got here, and I think that pattern will continue. That is, interpretations are most likely to be provoked or driven by some perception in Beijing that there's a serious problem to solve in Hong Kong. A quick point to close on basic law, and that is really to report something that hasn't happened. And what hasn't happened, there's never been any suggestion that I'm aware of from Beijing that Article 159 should be used. This is the article which allows for the basic law to be formally amended. And if you look at the wording, it's really quite easy for the Standing Committee to amend the basic law in this way, but they've stayed well away from that. And they haven't even brought it up, it hasn't been brought up anyhow in discussion as a possible long-term solution if Hong Kong is unable to enact laws under Article 23. So I think that also shows some level of significant restraint. Let me just finish with a quick observation about how Hong Kong has coped with political stress over the years. I've looked and quite a lot at particularly post-war, the various stresses in Hong Kong, the 56 riots, the 66 riots, Star Ferry riots, the 67 riots, the massive marches during the Tiananmen Square protest, and so on. And I just wanted to finish with a quick observation about Occupy Central. That movement, it lasted 79 days. And whatever you think of the outcome, whether you think it was a bad outcome or a good outcome or it was a good thing to do, I think there is one thing that's really clear, to me at least. It tells me something about the core qualities of Hong Kong. I cannot think of any city anywhere of this size that could have coped with a movement of that sort, shutting down 3 or 4 at times major arterial points of communication, and then just sprung back and got on with life once it was over. So it's a fairly positive story, but not one I think that's based on looking at the sky. I would say it's based on looking at the facts on the ground. Thank you, and I'll hand back to Christine.
The next chapter, chapter 5, talks about the economy. And in our book, we say Hong Kong's economic story stars China. And that has always been the case. And I think it's important for us to remember. And today, as the world clamors to enter the Chinese market, we mustn't forget that we are at the doorstep, and the reason that people want to enter the Chinese market is if you have an idea, a service, or a product, and if you can get it right for the Chinese market, the scale is colossal. So Hong Kong people are probably amongst the most familiar with the Chinese market. Also, we say in our book, is Hong Kong's economy is a function of location and culture. And empirically and logically, Hong Kong's strategic position vis-a-vis mainland China, plus its ability to digest East-West business culture, will remain Hong Kong's competitive advantage. We don't believe that Hong Kong's economic and business mojo is over, but we do emphasize that it is incumbent upon Hong Kong to continue to invest in excellence in every field, so that we're able to offer that higher level of service and management now that China is at a stage in her development where these things become more and more important. We also say in our book that in good times or bad, Hong Kong has always been a place where Asian and Western business method connected. So this will continue if we make it so a good place for this mixing of commercial activities. In fact, we go on to say here that Hong Kong's mojo is not just in business, i.e. commercial activities. We're also very good at non-profit activities. We have great associations for professionals, business associations, non-profits, philanthropic organizations. They are all operating at a pretty good level. So that's where the trajectory is for Hong Kong to be able to help China at this stage in her development. In the end, our last chapter is called The Hong Kong Story in Hong Kong Hands. It is for us to make it to that future where Hong Kong is a part of China. We start this particular chapter with the only phrase in the book which is in italics, and I'd like to read it to you. To put it simply and bluntly, Hong Kong must first and foremost accept the People's Republic for what it is today and work towards national betterment in good as well as difficult times. We think it's important that Beijing does not doubt Hong Kong's loyalty to China. Once that issue is settled, we think Hong Kong actually has more wiggle room to discuss many other things. But we put that out there. We think that's very important. So at this particular time, is it impossible for Hong Kong to pursue electoral reforms? We don't think so. We think it is possible. There has been a bit of a pause because we rejected the last proposal from China where we could elect the chief executive by universal suffrage, provided there was some kind of screening mechanism. We rejected it. I think it was extremely unfortunate. I would have liked to seen it going ahead. And just imagine in 2017 if we had that ability to elect the chief executive directly. Maybe we'll talk a bit more about that a little later. Other kinds of drawing on a Hong Kong story that is part of the story of China. Hong Kong is a part of southern China. We talk about the Greater Bay Area. We talk about more connection with Guangdong. Actually, Hong Kong has a very rich and thriving southern Chinese story. That is perhaps also a point of departure for Hong Kong to revive and understand. I would imagine it must be a good thing for Hong Kong and Guangdong to work together and think about what that story is. It's a good southern Chinese story. Hong Kong has had that cosmopolitan edge as well. We can uniquely add that international story. People from all over the world, including some of you sitting in the room, who've come to Hong Kong, who've added so much to Hong Kong. People from parts of Asia that have settled here. Hong Kong is that interesting blend precisely because we have that. So weaving that part of the story, the culture, the heritage, as we have more philanthropic foundations than ever in Hong Kong, what should they be investing in? We are investing in arts and culture. That is another great area for Hong Kong to claim a place in the sun. We are kind of getting there already. So I see many things that are potentially exciting that could be a part of rewriting the Hong Kong story. So I just like to read this final bit, which is right at the end of our book. So what this book affirms can be briefly stated so. First, Hong Kong owes much to the Chinese heritage of hard work and modesty. Second, it also owes much to a cosmopolitan experience through its time as British Hong Kong. Third, it has played and continues to play a vital part in China's re-engagement with the world. And finally, when you stand back and take a measured look, it is clear that the remarkable Hong Kong SAR experiment is not doing so badly at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the two of you for this rather optimistic view, I guess. The floor is open for questions. Please introduce yourself and raise.
Can I ask the first question, please?
Wait for the mic and introduce yourself, please, sir.
Can you not hear my voice?
Yes. Thank you.
John Ball. With regard to your ideas, you've obviously spent a very long time thinking about them, talking about them, and discussing them. What has been the reaction of those from, shall we say, the other side? What is their reaction to your ideas that are contained in that book?
May I ask for clarification? Who is the other side?
Shall I confess? People that are outside Hong Kong and in China, maybe.
Well, hopefully, after this talk here, which is our first public talk, the book's only been out literally for 2 weeks. I hope we can reach far and wide. But right now, I can't quite answer that question yet.
You've not discussed it with anybody at all before publication? You've not questioned people about it?
Maybe there are people in the room from the other side.
I mean, not so much the other side.
China, I mean China.
No.
Thank you.
I think there are some writers in the audience. Richard, shall we tell them the story of how our publishers here, our publisher said, okay, you can go and try and write it. This was at the end of June. I spent the summer in the United States, so I think around the 2nd of July, Richard and I said, okay, we'll put pen to paper. We wrote something. The publisher, I think in about 5 weeks, so this must have been in early August, we gave a script to the publisher. He said he didn't like it, he wasn't going to publish it. It was too boring. Wasn't what people wanted to read. So Richard and I sort of thought, do we carry on or do we, just pack it up, right? It was hard work. So of course we said, okay, let's carry on. So we wrote very quickly, and after about another 3 weeks, we kind of had a new script. And the publisher said, okay, this is slightly better. We can work with that. So that was it. We had no time to go talk to anybody, to be honest. Our publisher had seen it. I was highly critical. I guess at some stage, we have 1 or 2 lawyer friends and so on. So we asked for a bit of advice. That was it.
Can I just add one quick point there? Yes, we circulated early draft copies, I did, to people overseas, but not in China, I must say. Anyhow, the one good thing they did, and so we must acknowledge the wisdom of our publisher, they said once they started reading it, they couldn't put it down. Now, they had various responses, but at least they found it readable and it got them thinking.
Why couldn't they put it down?
Because it was so good. That's how I understand
The
it.
usual reason.
Yeah, I guess. Right. Actually, just to follow up on this, my question was also, since you're addressing mainly the Hong Kong people, whether it's going to be in Chinese as well?
A bit of advertising. I'm looking for a good Chinese translator.
Next question. Yes, please.
I enjoyed very much your talk. My name is John Antweiler, and I'm retired, but have chosen to live the rest of my life here in Hong Kong. I have not read your book. I will shortly. But I am curious, as you self-critique it, what would you say are maybe the 2 or 3 major vulnerabilities that you see, and that your book is optimistic, but what is the downside?
You want to have a go? I think it's an excellent piece of work. No criticisms from me.
I think one of the continuing vulnerability is the significant, profoundly difference between the two systems. They have to coexist. There have been tensions. There will continue to be tensions. We've got some tensions in the air at the moment about what is national security and what does it really mean. And that's going to take some time to work out. And I just add that the current geopolitical situation is just amplifying that problem.
A question here, please. The mic, thank you.
Hello, my name is Henry Ho. I work for think tank studying one country, two systems. So thank you for writing this book. I think it is written lightly, but the subject matter is quite heavy, at least to me, because we are talking about what's Hong Kong's role, or you're talking about narrative. Hopefully it will articulate our past, present and future, and having some hope for Hong Kong people, because you mentioned about anxiety, etc. I've read like 2 chapters last night. I remember 2 words, interpreter and decoder. So you mentioned that Hong Kong can be the interpreter and decoder, at least for Chinese politics or what happens in China, etc. So then it comes up with my question. You have the privilege, Christine, you have the privilege in working in the government before and met many mainland China's officials. So what do you think you can persuade, or how could you persuade the mainland authorities that we can be a good, first of all, he needs a decoder and interpreter, not a messenger, right? I think it's a difficult time for us, judging from what happened in this club, this venue, and in this building in the last few weeks. So how do you think, or how would you talk to or persuade or convince main authorities that you need a decoder interpreter and Hong Kong is the best one to do it?
I tend to think, well, first of all, I think Hong Kong should learn, and when I say Hong Kong should, I mean widely across the community, have an understanding of the Chinese political system. Whilst there are many experts in Hong Kong, it seems that it is the Chinese political system, and actually how it works, is not widely understood. I mean, many places around the world, students and people in general have to learn a bit about their own system. And I think whilst we learn about maybe what happens in Hong Kong, because one country, two systems perhaps, we do not study the Chinese political system. And I think we should study it, as a subject, so that we understand how China functions. And when we understand how something functions, we can then play a positive role, not propaganda, but explaining it to others. If we have been successful as a meeting place of East and West, then we can take on a job to explain to the world, when the world now is so interested in China, what and how China functions. But actually Hong Kong itself has a need to understand that in order to navigate our way as a part of China. So we can play this role at the same time. How we explain China to ourselves and to the world, because of our more cosmopolitan background, I would like to think it is possible for us to explain China to the world in a way that the world can understand. Because China is difficult, it's difficult for us. Chinese politics is a different system. How China puts forward her policies, how she explains her policies is different. The language the mainland uses in Chinese is also culturally different from how we use Chinese in Hong Kong. So, but it is an area of expertise. So I'd like to think that Hong Kong can take on that role. As for myself, my use of Chinese is not particularly good, and I'm very famous for that. However, my Chinese is good enough for me to converse and communicate with officials and others on the mainland, which I've been doing since 1980, because my first job was in Beijing. It's important to talk clearly. And again, even for me when I'm speaking to my counterparts on the mainland, it's finding that way of being able to communicate so that you are understood and that you understand them. And I think that is a skill that probably everybody in this room understands and know, because you've had to do it cross-culturally at various times. It is possible, and the results have been positive.
You're a very good diplomat, Christine. If I may, actually, I would like to ask you, number one, where are these voices in Hong Kong that could and should explain China to the rest of the world, as you seem to propose? And then another comment or question is, you said Beijing should not doubt Hong Kong's loyalty toward China, basically. I'm wondering if we should not ask the other question, that it's Hong Kong who should not doubt Beijing loyalty towards them. And the problem seems to be dual, because in Hong Kong there is this same, you mentioned anxiety to start with. So these are my 2 points.
I might ask you to explain again the second point. I just want to make sure I understand it, but perhaps I can answer the first one. There are many voices. I mean, I'm actually thinking of something relatively simple. We, of course, have scholars and others in Hong Kong who understand how the Chinese system works, but this isn't something that is prevalent. What I'm suggesting is Hong Kong actually has a need as Hong Kong, as a part of China, to understand how the country functions. I mean, I'm saying something really quite simple. So in terms of where the voices are, they're embedded in the community. We can go and learn it ourselves in many ways. There's a lot of literature around. I'd like to think that Hong Kong people want to take an interest in this, because we have to navigate. Hong Kong has to navigate our way in China. So, do you mind repeating the second question?
No, the question, it was more like the way you put things, by saying Beijing should not doubt Hong Kong's loyalty towards Chinese authorities, implying that maybe Hong Kong should be better behaved or whatever, so that Beijing is reassured that everything is fine with Hong Kong. But I think from the Hong Kong side, Hong Kong needs to be assured that Beijing only wants the good of Hong Kong. So that's, which way do you look at this relationship, basically?
I was, of course, referring to independence. I mean, the loyalty, the basic loyalty is that you're a part of the same country. In terms of whether China has Hong Kong's best interest at heart, well, I'm prepared to accept that it does. But how the two sides look at what these interests are, this is where we need to have a lot more dialogue. Now, it has not been easy for a whole variety of reasons that I don't think I'm going to go into as to the relationship between Hong Kong and Beijing in terms of having that discussion. And I think we need to find ways to revive and enhance and expand that discussion.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, over there.
Thank you. Kin Ming Liu, a former journalist and an FCC member. Since you are speaking at the FCC, would you care to share your views with us on what happened to the club recently?
Richard and I are here today because Richard Mallett invited me. He invited me. Sorry, it's okay. Richard and I are here because Victor Mallett invited me, and he invited me at a time before we even started writing the book. I'm sorry he is not here today. In terms of what's happening, maybe I can put it like this. Perhaps more things will happen, not necessarily in relations to the FCC, because we seem to have entered a space and zone where national security, what that means, is being defined. And I think this is a sensitive moment. It is being defined for Hong Kong at a time when geopolitics is also shifting. So the main show may be Hong Kong for us, but the main show is not necessarily Hong Kong. So this is a very sensitive time for many people. Probably it's a good time to take a pause and think about these wider, difficult issues. Florence and I were having a chat before coming into this room. We don't have any great words of wisdom or strategy to offer, but at a time when things around you are shifting, maybe taking a pause and just reflecting on these wider issues, as well as what we think is to the best interest of Hong Kong, might be a good way to go.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can end on these words of wisdom from Christine, and thank you very much, Professor Cullen, as well. Please join me in applauding them and thanking them. And a little token of appreciation. Souvenir. Tie for you and a pen for you. Thanks.
Thank you.